Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
This legislation will make it clear that Georgia is not going down the path of failure seen by other states and communities that have eliminated cash bail.
As Republican state lawmakers pass legislation overhauling how the accused are treated, Democrats worry Georgia is going in the wrong direction.
A bill that, if enacted, would undermine the historic bipartisan criminal justice reform efforts led by former Governor Nathan Deal.
On the podcast today, we dig into that with WABE criminal justice reporter Shemaine Cruz.
Plus a pointed warning from the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court.
Our judicial system simply cannot fulfill its obligation to deliver justice without a full array of court reporters, prosecutors, public defenders, court staff, and even sheriff's deputies.
And Republican lawmakers moved to strip QR codes from ballots.
No QR codes, no barcodes, no marks that are non-human readable.
I'm WABE politics reporter Raul Ballard.
And I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlass. It's week 5 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from Political Breakfast and WABE News in Atlanta.
So, Raul, I know you've had a crappy week with a cold and some sniffles that kept you out of the Capitol for a few days. And if I know anything about you, I know how hard that probably was for you to stay away from the Gold Dome for a whole 2 days.
I hate being away from the Capitol. I mean, when we're not in session, I'm here a few days a week. But the reason I mention it is it's a good reminder that a lot of the Georgia legislature is available online, whether it's bills or videos of hearings on YouTube. If there are issues you care about, there are always ways to find out about it. And then if you want to come here, there are ways to talk about and advocate for it.
Yeah, it's like the best expression of this idea that we hear about the Capitol being the people's house, where it's open to every person who lives in the state.
You know, Sam, just this week, we've had Physicians Day, Georgia Baptist Pastors Day, UGA Day, Civil Engineers Day. I mean, just yesterday, I helped a family find their way into the Capitol. They were here to advocate for better support and better funding for intellectual and developmental disability programs. There are so many groups and so many individuals who make their way here to, as you say, the people's house to advocate in the state capitol.
And I should say that just the other week, I saw a couple of people in alligator costumes advocating for protecting the Okefenokee Swamp. So even some critters make their way into the Capitol. All right, Raul, let's get down to business. One of the big questions swirling around the legislative session is the future of the massive Georgia film tax credit. And now it looks like we have an answer. What did we learn?
So, Sam, state leaders and lawmakers understand how critical the film tax credit has been to the explosion in the state's film and TV industry. But you know, Sam, when it's costing about $1 billion a year and growing, and the state budget is $35 billion, there are absolute concerns about cost. Here's what State House Speaker John Burns had to say.
We've heard a lot of talk about this with our film tax credit, which has been very, very successful for Georgia. We want to make sure that we streamline our tax credit so we continue to get the absolute best return on that investment for Georgia.
And so that brings us, Sam, to House Bill 1180, which was introduced right after the speaker spoke, along with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. Here's what that bill does. It increases the bar on what productions get this tax credit. It goes from productions of $500,000 to $1 million. Also, some of the credits, these lucrative tax credits, are going to be tied to specific guideposts, like using 50% of your workers' who are residents of the state of Georgia, or 50% of the vendors being inside the state of Georgia. And the last thing that's getting a lot of attention are the limits on what's called transferability. The tax bills of some of these productions, these tax credits may be bigger than their actual tax bill. So what do? They turn around and sell those tax credits. They transfer those tax credits. They make a few dollars, and then people in Georgia who have really big tax bills, they save a few bucks by buying these credits. Messing with those, changing those, that may end up being an issue in itself. Now, let me tell you a couple other things that are important. It is notable that the lead sponsor of House Bill 1180 is Republican State Representative Casey Carpenter. He's one of the leading proponents of the film tax credit. Now, all of this is just happening, so I'm also looking forward to seeing the reaction from the entertainment industry. One other quick note. That was interesting from that press conference. Another tax credit that's being targeted deals with data centers. The speaker noted that these data centers are using a lot of power. And so that's also one of the things I want to be following when it comes to tax credits.
Raul, this is interesting to me because, as you know, I'm a Michigander. And for a while, the state of Michigan had a film tax credit and a burgeoning film industry, which all but disappeared when they eliminated their tax credit a few years back. So I'll be interested to see what happens here. I want to stick with taxes for a moment. There was another interesting debate this week about taxes, this time related to sales tax exemptions. Tell me more.
So the state Senate this week approved a Republican-backed 5-day sales tax holiday for guns, ammo, gun safes, all sorts of accessories. Democrats argue that this shows the priority of Republicans, and specifically when it comes to, as you say, exemptions on sales taxes. Here's Democratic State Senator Nabila Islam Parks.
Think about it. Essentials like baby formula and diapers. And let's not forget the bill to eliminate the discriminatory sales tax on menstrual products for women and girls, pads and tampons, a monthly medical necessity. Today is a stark testament to where our priorities lie when we can't muster the political will to ease the struggles of everyday Georgians, but can leap into action for a sales tax holiday on guns.
So Senate Bill 344 now goes to the State House. And I should mention that another sales tax holiday that was mentioned during the debate, the school sales tax holiday that actually went away a few years ago, new legislation was just filed to bring that one back.
And I just want to point out that Democratic members, specifically Representative Michelle Au, have been working on a bill that would extend a tax credit on firearms storage that seemed like it might have traction even among some Republicans. So I'll be curious to see if that still has legs this year. I texted the representative this morning and she says she thinks so. She said to think about the difference between, $10 in sales tax a few days out of the year versus, say, a $200 tax credit available year round.
So, Sam, let's talk about some of the election bills that are speeding through the legislature ahead of the 2024 election. This week, the Senate advanced a bill that would stop using the QR codes that are on ballots. Sam, what are they talking about here?
Okay, so, Raul, I think you usually vote in person, right?
Yes.
So you'll know that when you go and vote in person, you probably remember making your selections on a touch screen, right?
Yeah.
Then after that, a ballot prints off with your choices both in written text and then also in the form of a QR code. That QR code is read by a scanner, and that is what actually counts the vote. SB 189 requires that the written text be used to actually count the vote. Republican lawmakers like Senator Max Burns, who we heard from at the top of the show, think that this will help build confidence in election integrity.
But Sam, it just feels like there's a catch to all of this.
Well, election officials say that this would be physically impossible to implement for the 2024 election. The Secretary of State's office says ditching QR codes would require purchasing and testing new software, printers, scanners, and ballots. Some Republican lawmakers have talked to an election tech company that says they have this scanner that could read the text on the existing ballots, but that the technology has never been used in any statewide election. I want to read you the statement I got from Deputy Secretary of State Jordan Fuchs, and she said, quote, "It would be impossible to run the 2024 election."
So one more thing to worry about with the 2024 elections for us, Sam. While we are looking ahead to the election, I want to ask you, is there a timing update around former President Donald Trump's legal cases. There was the big ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit. What did that say? And what does it possibly tell us about the scheduling of the Georgia election interference case?
Well, the top line, Raul, former President Trump does not have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. But here's the thing. Trump's federal trial, which had been scheduled to go first, has already been delayed. And if the U.S. Supreme Court takes up this immunity question on appeal, the federal case wouldn't be expected to go to trial until late this summer, right when prosecutors want to kick off the Georgia trial. So is it even possible then for the Georgia trial to happen at all this year? I put that question to Norm Eisen at the Brookings Institution, who's been following this case, and he told me that the cases could go in succession. So the Georgia case could probably start right after the federal trial ends without a whole lot of buffer, since there's different legal teams working for the former president on these two cases. And so that would mean a Georgia trial beginning possibly in September, right as the election is getting into full swing.
And Sam, before we take a break, I want to stay at the Fulton County Courthouse, which is about a block and a half away from where I'm sitting. Can you update us on the efforts to disqualify Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis from the case?
Yes. Now, more than half of the defendants have joined in this effort to dismiss the case and Willis on the grounds of a conflict of interest stemming from a relationship with a special prosecutor. Just a quick catch up, Willis has now acknowledged that relationship, says it began after she hired special prosecutor Nathan Wade, and that there was no personal or financial conflict. And she's now fighting subpoenas to testify at an evidentiary hearing before Judge Scott McAfee next week. So that will be the day, Raul, to really pay attention to see what happens with this case next.
And I should mention, you're going to be in court for that next week.
Yes, I will. And we will update you on the next episode of Gold Dome Scramble.
For now, let's take a break here. This is Gold Dome Scramble from WABE.
Hey, y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
Mm-hmm.
WABE. Sounds Like ATL is a music documentary series that takes an in-depth look at the artists amplifying Atlanta's famed music community. Built around a desire to highlight Atlanta's diverse and world-renowned music scene, each episode features unforgettable, intimate musical performances by fresh new musical guests, each with exclusive interviews about the stories behind their music. Listen at WABE.org or wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome back to Gold Dome Scramble. Joining us now is Shemaine Cruz, criminal justice reporter here at WABE. Hey, Shemaine.
Hey, Sam. Happy to be here.
So before we get into the news and the stories of the day, Shemaine, I want to ask you a question that I actually get sometimes when I'm out and about. What does it mean to be a criminal justice reporter?
I love that question. I say that I get to look at how decisions are made by people in power. That includes the sheriff, county commissioners, the mayor, and police chief, and how that impacts people's daily lives. And more often than not, that means I'm either reading through court documents, sitting in a courtroom, or covering some kind of protest or press conference, and then looking for people at these events to help explain the bigger picture. So it's a lot more than just covering the big crime story of the day. I want to know if there's a trend and what can be done about it. And I just like to tell everyone that I really love what I do.
And Shemaine, since you joined WABE, your beat has been so busy, whether it's covering the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, conditions at the Fulton County Jail, Georgia's prisons, deadly police interactions. Is there something that runs through all of these stories, like a common thread?
Well, I think the obvious answer is that they all involve people, right? That includes individuals who are directly impacted, as well as their families and sometimes victims. And I try to capture those human stories through my work because I think it's easy to get carried away with numbers or headlines. But you have to remember that these are people's lives, and often It's taxpayer money that's being used to fund, for example, the weapons used in deadly police interactions, the construction of the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, and the daily operations of the Fulton County Jail. So we all have a stake in these type of issues.
So, Sam, I quickly wanted to talk about one of the big criminal justice stories here at the Capitol this week, the State of the Judiciary address. Lawmakers met in a joint session to hear from the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Michael Boggs. What did he share, Sam?
So Boggs told lawmakers that growing threats against judges could imperil the justice system. He highlighted proposed legislation to prohibit state and local governments from making judges' personal information like home addresses publicly available. And Raul, this stuck with me because it's been an issue I've been tracking when it comes to election officials, jurors, public health officials, and other public servants. You know, between 2015 and 2022, the U.S. Marshals Service reported a threefold increase in threats against federal judges, court staff, and jurors. Just take a minute and think about that number. And Boggs says Georgia judges face a similar climate here.
Georgia judges will not be threatened or intimidated into abandoning their constitutional duties. But incidents like these are repugnant to the rule of law, and if left unchecked, they threaten the very independence of our judiciary.
And you know, when you talk about safety, I can't help but remember covering the 2005 Fulton County Courthouse shootings when a suspect who was on trial escaped. He eventually killed a judge, a court reporter, a sheriff's deputy, and a federal agent. But you know, Sam, while courthouse security is still a very big deal, what we're talking about here is different.
Exactly. I talked to another justice after Boggs' speech, and he told me that the threat environment really used to be focused on hardening courthouses, but so much of the threat now has been trained on people's lives outside the court. Just think of all the recent swatting instances against lawmakers and other officials, or doxing of grand jurors' home addresses after the Trump indictment. So that's something that I'll be certainly keeping my eyes on. Something else I'm watching, Boggs says the judicial system is facing an acute workforce shortage with challenges recruiting and retaining prosecutors, public defenders, and other court staff. And without them, Boggs says the judicial system cannot fulfill its obligations to deliver justice. And so I just want to bring Shemaine back here. Shemaine, is this something that you've heard from your sources on the criminal justice beat?
Absolutely. I think I was covering a state Senate hearing a few weeks ago in connection to an investigation that legislators are conducting into the overcrowding and dangerous conditions at the Fulton County Jail. And one thing that came up is that a vast majority, I believe it's 90%, of all defendants who go before a judge are represented by a public defender. Pair that with the court backlog that we saw get really bad after the COVID-19 pandemic, and you can see why there's such a big issue with staffing. Another thing that came up during this hearing is that prosecutors with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office say the county needs more judges to be able to get through more cases quicker. So yes, these are all issues that I'm constantly hearing about at special hearings and county commissioners' meetings. It's constantly coming up.
You know, you mentioned that special legislative investigation of the Fulton County Jail. What have been some of the other takeaways in these hearings?
Well, Raul, it's my understanding that legislators think the issues at the Fulton County Jail can better be handled locally. Because when this investigation was launched last year, the U.S. Department of Justice had already started looking into staff shortages and overcrowding. And so far, legislators have held hearings with the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office. I know they plan to speak with judges next. And one thing that all these people have said so far is that they need more staff. And we hear that over and over, like I said. So this comes while Fulton County Sheriff Pat Labatt has been pushing for a new facility that, as I understand it, could be 4 times larger than the current jail and cost upwards of $2 billion. But one thing I'd like to point out is that since these investigations were started, the county has made progress toward reducing the jail population, specifically at the main jail on Rice Street. And they've done that by moving some of the detainees to other facilities that the county already owns. The sheriff had previously said that they couldn't do that because they needed more staff, and even proposed sending detainees to facilities in South Georgia and Mississippi, but things have improved.
So I wanted to talk about one of the big bills this week, Senate Bill 63, which is now on Governor Brian Kemp's desk. It deals with bail and bonds for people who've been arrested and charged with a crime. Explain what this bill would do if the governor signs it into law.
Well, Senate Bill 63 could keep more people in jail for longer, and that's because the legislation would add 30 additional crimes, mostly misdemeanors, that would now require cash bail. And at the same time, it would limit charitable bail funds, which are used to help people in need get released from jail. Now, supporters of this legislation say it's meant to target repeat and violent offenders and to prevent no-shows in court. But what opponents are saying is that it will actually penalize the poor.
So, Shemaine, I want to pick up on that thread. You've talked about how important it is to center real people who are affected by policy in your reporting. And I know you've been doing some of that work as it relates to SB 63. So tell us what you've learned.
That's right. I recently spoke with Erin George. She's the director of policy at the Bail Project, which is a national nonprofit that has paid bail for over 1,500 Georgians since 2019. Here's what Erin George had to say about Senate Bill 63.
What this proposed policy is doing is doubling down on the failed tough on crime policies of the past. We have ended up in the circumstance of mass incarceration and mass pretrial jailing exactly because of policies like this.
I also spoke with 60-year-old Sherry Baird recently. She was pulled over by police 2 years ago and booked into the DeKalb County Jail. At the time, she says she had her beloved dog, a little black Shih Tzu named Onyx, riding in the car with her, and she offered to pay for a foster home or someplace where her dog could be taken care of while she was in jail. However, she says she couldn't pay her $10,000 bail, and she ended up sitting in jail for 5 weeks, which is when the Bail Project stepped in, only to be told by officials when she was released that Onyx had been taken to a local shelter and had already been adopted. Baird says she has never been indicted for the charges she's accused of, and she says that she thinks she would still be in jail if the Bail Project hadn't helped her out.
I think that's really unfair because I know, especially in the South, most of us, we don't have a lot of money. And so they're passing legislation that suits them. It doesn't suit the fact that that dog has a home and it knows where it wants to be, because it's used to that. And so if they do that, they're going to have more dogs in shelters and you have more kids in foster care. I mean, it's going to be a trickle-down thing.
Shemaine, this goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning of this segment. We cover a lot of legislation up here, but what you're doing is explaining is what this means to people, what this means when these things are implemented and are practiced. Another part of this bill that's getting a lot of attention has to do with who can pay someone's bail and post bond, and even how often.
Yeah, so going back to what I mentioned earlier, this bill would severely limit charitable bail funds. That includes churches, protest groups, and individual people because they would only be allowed to pay bail for 3 people a year unless they register as an official bond company. That's interesting to me because under Georgia law, only the county sheriff can decide who can register as a bondsman. This just makes me think about the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, which has been paying bail for protesters for years, like before the whole controversy surrounding the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center even started. And as I'm sure you remember, 3 of its organizers were arrested last year and charged with charity fraud and money laundering. Activists with the so-called Stop Cop City movement say this bill is just another way the state is trying to silence and punish protesters. But like Erin George with the Bail Project pointed out, this would affect all Georgians who are accused of a crime.
Shemaine and Sam, I went to a press conference involving some Democratic lawmakers, Georgia and AACP leadership, and they're raising legal and constitutional concerns around this. Here's Democratic State Senator Josh McLaurin, who connected this with the Citizens United ruling.
That was a watershed Supreme Court case in which we were told by the Supreme Court that money can be equivalent to speech. And if we're going to allow unlimited money in our elections to influence the outcome and pretend like that is completely First Amendment speech, and if that's the law of the land, then it's kind of absurd to say that a church that wants to exercise its right, its expressive right to support its community members, again, by just spending money. And they're not making money doing that. They're not like a company that needs to be regulated that has an income stream, but they're just donating purely voluntary dollars based on a sincerely held belief. And we've seen the Supreme Court care a lot about those sincerely held religious beliefs as well. It just would be a lot of hypocrisy, I think.
And this week, the ACLU announced they intend to file a lawsuit if Senate Bill 63 is signed into law on similar grounds.
And this is something we'll, of course, be watching at WABE. Shemaine Cruz, WABE criminal justice reporter, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your reporting.
Thanks, guys.
And that's it for this week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Hellman.
You can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out wabe.org/underthegoldome. We'll be back next week.